So how do we improve conflict in the boardroom? Maybe you notice that you have particular tendency in the way that you respond to conflict when it shows up. And maybe you also have observed that within your peer group, within your leadership team, you have a particular way in which you as a group tend to respond to conflict or disagreement, which could be that you get very combative in that conflict, or it might be that you get very deferential, you kind of avoid the conflict, whatever it might be. It's quite normal for there to be these default paradigms, if you like, for how we respond to conflict, whether that's at an individual level or at a collective team level. And what I notice is that most leaders have enough humility to realize that there may be things they're not seeing. And so they do tend to be open to other people's points of view, new information that may change the way they're seeing things and ultimately change the decisions that they arrive at. However, it's also true that it's really common for conflict at the top level of organizations, and even when the people at the top level are really smart, it's still really quite common for conflict to be avoided or for it to become really counterproductive because we're being too positioned, like too vocal, too assertive, or whatever it might be. And so the question is, what's the solution to that? How can we improve on that? And my observation as a coach who works with leaders at the top of large organizations is that when leaders have what I call a securely located sense of self, which I refer to as the who I am, that greater reality of self that's entirely positive in nature that we all have within us, when leaders are able to understand what that is and have a secure sense of what that is inside of them, in psychology that's sometimes called a secure sense of the intrinsic self, when leaders have that, the quality of conflict improves. And it improves because that secure sense of self exists beyond the current conditions. It exists beyond whatever outcomes we might arrive at. And so it's very easy for that secure self to engage without feeling threatened, without needing to be defensive or to be overly positioned or overly assertive in its point of view. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't have a very clear point of view. You may have a very clear point of view and a very strong sense of what makes most sense. But you also at the same time feel kind of relaxed about it in quite a profound way because your sense of self is not dependent on the outcome here. And that's important. And it's important because it then becomes easier for you to see and hear what other people have to offer. And in fact, you'll find that you tend to become naturally very curious, in fact, especially when someone's saying something that you disagree with or that just doesn't make sense to you. You'll find that you naturally become inquiring, like, help me understand more about what you're seeing there, because I don't get it, or I disagree, but I want to understand how the world looks from your point of view, which is really the opposite of that response of becoming irritated or more entrenched in your position when someone says something that you think just doesn't make any sense. The other aspect of having that secure sense of self in play when you're in a conflict situation is that it actually becomes easier to assert your point of view too. And especially when others may not be understanding your point of view or they may not be receptive to it, it becomes easier to assert it and assert it in a way in which that they are able to better hear it and receive it. Because again, your sense of self is securely located within you. And so there's little risk to that sense of self if others disagree. And so there's again no need to defend and there's no need to attack. And that's really important because it affects the way that you're asserting your point of view, such that it is easier for people to receive it. So what do I mean by that? Okay, so when we're communicating, the frequency of our communication is what's received over and above the content of what we're delivering. Okay, so let me just illustrate that. So imagine this is you, and you've got a point of view that you're communicating. So that's the content of what you're communicating to your peer. Okay? But it's also delivered with a frequency. There's a frequency to that delivery. So maybe you're irritated and you're articulating really well your point of view, but it's also being delivered with a frequency of irritation. And actually, that frequency is what's going to be received over and above the content. The thing to understand here is that frequency is being determined by your inner state. It's very hard to fake it. So whatever your inner state is going to be what communicates, even if you think you're doing a really good job of masking it. And maybe even if you're not even aware of it, that frequency is determined by your inner state, and that frequency is going to be what's received by the other person over and above the content. Now, the interesting thing is the greater reality of who you are, that securely located sense of self, is actually very relaxed about the outcomes because it knows that it exists beyond those outcomes. And as such, it has what I call a non-positioned state. And so when you're communicating from that self, people feel it. And when they feel that, they'll actually be less defensive and more receptive to what you're saying. Doesn't mean that they will necessarily agree with what you're saying, agree with your point of view, but they will be more likely to hear it and to receive and consider what you have to say. Something else that's worth noting here is that when you're able to communicate from that sense of self, debate can actually become more heated. There's more permission to get heated, in fact, because that secure self is undisturbed by the heat. It doesn't get more positioned in response to it, which typically will happen, right? Like typically when things get really heated, people get more entrenched in their position. But in fact, when you can operate from that secure sense of self, you'll find that you're actually giving permission to the other people in the room to release some of that heat, if that's what's needed. Sometimes that is what's needed. Sometimes it's important that we do have more heat in the debate. So by bringing that frequency of self, that secure sense of self into the room, you're actually encouraging others into that frequency too. And you'll find that the level of debate, the level of the quality of the conflict improves. You'll find that there's a higher level of understanding that's achieved, better decisions therefore get made. And even if we disagree, we're able to achieve greater alignment. So my point of view is that when you're confronted with conflict, the more you can bring that presence of self, that greater reality of self, into the room and around the table, the better the outcomes are going to be.